And then I think we could probably go ahead and get started, Doug. Nadja, if you'll take over letting people in for me.
Okay. Morning, everyone. First, I'd like to thank you for attending this meeting. I know it's a busy time of year for everyone, but it is important that we get together every now and again to recognize all of our efforts at creating a better, cleaner place for us to live in our communities. Second, I would like to express my thanks to David Gress for serving on the executive board for the last 2 years. And lastly, I'd like to thank the MARC staff for their efforts. Lisa McDaniel, Nadja Carpolo, Matt Riggs, and Ton Jacobs have kept us moving forward and provided a consistent platform for us to operate. There are others, but these fine people contribute regularly in our meetings and the day-to-day work. They've been an invaluable resource for our organization of volunteers. They're dedicated and inspiring to us all. Sometimes the work that we do here is lost in the day-to-day activities, frustrations, and work outside of this organization, but please be assured that what we do has an impact on making our planet and our cities and towns a better and healthier place, not only for us, but for future generations. We provide funding to area businesses and organizations that encourage and allow them to contribute to this cause as well. We encourage and promote better practices about recycling and reusing, and what we do has an impact, and it does help. You should be proud of the work that we do, and again, I thank you for all that you've done and continue to do. The first item on the agenda is to vote on members of the executive board. The nominating committee has proposed the following slate. Lauren Kurtz from Lake Lotawana, she's returning. David Pavlich in Kearney is returning. Matt Wright in Blue Springs is returning. And Trent Salisbury in Raymore is a new person to add to the executive board. Is there a motion to approve these names to serve on the executive board?
This is Chris Besson. I'll move to approve the slate.
Is there a second?
This is Matt Wright with Blue Springs. I'll second.
Okay. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none. All in favor of approving these names to serve on the executive board, say aye.
Aye.
Or give us a thumbs up. And any opposed, say no or give us a thumbs down. Thank you all. Since you've approved the reinstatement of Matt Wright, there's no need to elect a new vice chair because Matt and I were elected last year to serve a 2-year term. So I'll now turn it over to Lisa, and she's going to provide some additional information and introduce our speaker for the day.
Okay.
Lisa?
Thanks, Doug. Morning, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Solid Waste Program Manager at MARC, and I'm the planner for the MARC Solid Waste Management District. This meeting is normally the highlight of our year, and we're so sorry. It's the second year now we haven't been able to meet in person, and we'll keep our fingers crossed for next year, and that we'll all be able to get back together. I'd like to thank the executive board members for their work this year. We've managed to continue our work and hold all of our meetings virtually to conduct the district's business. While some of our projects have slowed down, we do have some high points that I'd like to share from 2021. The district awarded more than $678,000 in grant funding to 13 organizations. We had supported 5 small projects with additional funding of more than $12,000. With additional partners this year, our Recycle More at Work partnership has grown to at least 125 partner organizations. We did have to scale back some of our technical assistance, but we're able to continue much of our support virtually. We've been working with US EPA Region 7 and a group of other Missouri partners to promote market development for recyclables. The district is leading efforts to advocate for extended producer responsibility program in Missouri for paint. The American Coatings Association is planning to have a bill introduced during the upcoming legislative session, and we're very excited about that. We've also been leading efforts in Missouri to educate consumers about drug take-back opportunities. We've developed a statewide database of permanent kiosks and rolled out an interactive map at the beginning of the year. We continue to reduce food waste in the metro. We received grant funding from US EPA Region 7 this fall to develop a regional plan. We're coordinating the development of a regional approach to reduce illegal dumping in 4 strategic areas of enforcement, education, data, and infrastructure. And one last highlight, our outreach efforts continue to bring users to recyclespot.org. We're on track again this year to have more than 100,000 users visit our site. And we're very excited to announce that we're going to be redoing the site next year. So we look forward to continuing many of the same projects next year, and again, hopefully returning to in-person meetings. So I'd like to thank everyone for their support. And now I'm going to turn it over to Matt to introduce our speaker.
All right, thank you, Lisa. So our speaker today is Jonathan Bloom. Jonathan is a journalist, consultant, and thought leader on the topic of food waste. He wrote the book American Wasteland and created the website Wasted Food. He's also written many articles on food waste for such publications as National Geographic, The Washington Post, LA Times, Huffington Post, Mother Jones, and many more. Those are all on his website if you want to check those out. He's also spoken on food waste from New York to New Zealand and has consulted with the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, Harvard Law School, NRDC, General Mills, and Minneapolis Public Schools. Most recently, he helped create Food Matters, the Commission for Environmental Cooperation's free educational resource. So you may be wondering, what was it that sparked Jonathan's interest in food waste? And as occurs with a lot of us when we find our passion or our main point of interest in life, it was personal experiences that brought him to this work. Back in 2005, which is the year he began researching this topic, 2 experiences made him aware of just how much food is wasted. One was volunteering at the DC Central Kitchen, which is a homeless shelter that rescues unused food items from restaurants and supermarkets. And the other was gleaning, or gathering crops that would otherwise be left in the field and distributing them to the hungry. So those personal experiences solidified his commitment to this cause. So with that in mind, and without further ado, Jonathan, take it away.
All right, wonderful. Well, good morning, and I'm honored to be here. It's really neat to be a part of this meeting, and I'm especially appreciative of being introduced by someone who maybe knows Eco Elvis or knows how to get in touch with him. Okay, so let me share my screen here and we shall get started. Okay, is that looking about right? Okay,
It's perfect.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to assume everyone can see what's happening and let me know if anything goes awry. But anyway, I have a few things to say about food waste, so why don't I just jump on in? There's a lot going on in the world today, as you may or may not have heard. Plenty of current events, but I think there's never been a better time to focus on this topic of food waste or wasted food, because it has such a magnificent and potentially harmful yet potentially beneficial impact. So what I'm going to do today is talk a bit about that impact and why we should focus on not wasting food. And then later on, I'll get into some of the opportunities or solutions with this topic. So on a big picture level, there's certainly a lot of food being squandered across this country and around the world. You see the numbers there. Those are estimates, but have been pretty steady across the years that I've been focusing on this topic. So, about a third to a little more of our food supply is not used. And that certainly adds up domestically. you're looking at about 160 billion pounds, as you can see there, and that comes at a pretty significant cost. So those are some ballpark figures for you, but I find those numbers sometimes don't quite capture the picture of wasted food in America. So what I like to do is actually show you a ballpark picture that might convey how much food is being wasted in this country. So this is the Rose Bowl in Southern California, and that 90,000 seat stadium could be filled with the food that's wasted every day in America. And it might look something like that. So if we were to aggregate all of the wasted food to one central location, there would be enough to fill the Rose Bowl with food waste. And in fact, there's enough these days that we could probably fill it twice. When I first started researching the book, it was close to double, but I wanted to err on the side of caution. But by this point, partly due to the growing population and partly due to the fact that we haven't reduced the amount of food we're wasting, there's enough to fill that stadium twice every day. Okay, but bringing things a little closer to home, you might be wondering if that might do the trick at Arrowhead Stadium. And sorry, Chiefs fans, the same would happen if we were to do that locally. So where is all this wasted food coming from? Well, the short answer is everywhere. Every step of the food chain produces excess food, and that excess is built into the system. But it starts certainly on the farm level, where many crops aren't even harvested. The long distance food chain means that things that are perfectly good on a day of harvesting might not necessarily be in great condition by the time they reach a store a week later, and wouldn't have the shelf life that retailers want. So you'll see perfectly good heads of lettuce like this one that are just left behind, unpicked in the field. And now that's sort of where the gleaning can come into play, but more on that later. And this is actually a lettuce farm I visited in Salinas, California, the lettuce bowl of the world, or the salad bowl of the world, as they call it. And I was pretty astounded by what was left behind. The squandering certainly continues at the retail or supermarket level, often driven by this obsession with freshness that many stores have in most of their departments, and additionally driven by the dates stamped on packages. And these are all bagged salads that were perfectly fine today, but had a sell-by date of that day on them. And so out with the trash they went. And in fact, I worked at a supermarket as part of the research for my book. And the first task I had before I even had a name tag was to throw out food. The manager pointed me to the wall of refrigerated and bagged produce and told me to pull anything with a date of today on it. So that was my introduction to the world of retail food. So the waste certainly continues on at the restaurant or institutional cafeteria level, in part driven by the large portions that we might receive, or the all-you-can-eat model that's so popular at colleges. And as a result of those policies, we see a lot of food being thrown away, just like that one there. And finally, the waste continues on at the household level. We often fill our refrigerators to the point that we couldn't possibly use everything before it goes bad. We don't like the sight of a sparse refrigerator. We like to feel an abundance of food in our homes. And as a result, it gets a little cluttered in there, and out of sight is out of mind. And out of mind means usually out of eating condition. And we might find things a couple weeks later when they're not quite ideal in terms of edibility, and things might get a little squishy or off. And so we often kind of create this problem for ourselves of wasted food in the home. And just a quick estimate, as you saw at the beginning there, about a quarter or 25% of the food that we bring home, we don't end up using. And just in case you're wondering how I got a refrigerator picture from your own home, well, I'm not able to divulge my secrets, but let's just say I have my people on the inside. Okay, so what's going on here? Why are we wasting so much food? Certainly, people don't set out to waste about 40% of the food supply, but it happens for a variety of factors. And so I'll talk about those individually. Now, the first topic here on why we waste so much food is abundance. And what I mean by that is we produce about twice the amount of food that we need per person on a calorie basis. So it's not terribly surprising that we don't end up using almost half of our food supply. Now, what this looks like, this abundance, it looks like a few different things, but on the farm level, it might look like this. And this image comes from a gleaning outing not too far from my house in North Carolina. And these are all the excess sweet potatoes that have been harvested that weren't picked for retail sale, but were left behind in the field. And so you'll have entire fields often that aren't harvested, at times driven by the price of a good, might not justify the expenditure of labor. And I'm sure you've heard labor is pretty hard to come by these days. And so you have pictures like this where there's just so much left in the field to be harnessed and harvested. Now, the problem here is what happens when there aren't gleaning outings, and what happens in the fields where no one comes through to pick things for those in need. So that is where a lot of our primary level or farm level loss comes from. Now, this abundance, in addition to meaning a great loss of potential nourishment, also leads to a cheapening of food in both the literal and figurative sense. So because we have so much food, the cost of that item is pretty low. And also it creates this mindset where we don't tend to value our food because there's so much of it, because food is everywhere. And we not only see it in abundance in supermarkets, but these days, especially in other settings like restaurants, where when you order an item, the portion size might look something like this. And I'll level with you here. I have no idea what this is a picture of. I would guess that it involves eggs and cheese. I would also guess that it's more calories than most people would want to consume in one sitting. But unfortunately, that's a common sight these days at restaurants, and it creates this tricky situation where you have maybe two bad choices. You could overeat, you could eat too much food, or you can waste food and not use all of it. Now, of course, there's a third way, or a middle road, where you might take home the leftovers, but people might be going out afterwards. They might not be going straight home. They might be some of those strange folks who don't like leftovers. I don't quite understand, but I'm trying to get to know you folks. But back to this situation, it's an unfortunate one because it has root causes for both wasting food and the obesity crisis. So restaurant abundance leads to trouble. Next on the list of causes of food waste is this concept of beauty. And what I mean there is that most everyone in the food system is committed to having this situation where appearance trumps taste. And it's a little strange, although we do eat with our eyes, or so I hear. But unfortunately, the consequence of that mindset is that anything that's the wrong shape, size, or color, or God forbid, has a small blemish on it, well, that will get cast aside or tossed at some point in the food chain. And so I explored this topic a little more in depth in my research, and I visited this pear orchard in California. And this is a gent named Nick Avisovich. He runs an orchard in Lakeport, and he was telling me why things wouldn't be harvested or why they'd be left behind. And I visited with him like right after harvesters had come through for the annual harvest. He used to have 2 harvests a year, but labor was scarce. So at that point, it was just once a year. And he kept picking the pears that had been left behind and examining them, as you see him doing there. And he had a hard time actually finding anything wrong with a lot of the pears he pulled down. When he finally did locate some that weren't pristine, they had small blemishes like this one, and that would mean that they'd be left behind. And so unfortunately, because of this desire for perfection and homogeneity with our food supply, you have the picture like this one that you see here, where at the bottom of every tree in the orchard, there are countless pears that were left to rot right where they grew. All right, another driver of wasted food is cost. And despite rising food prices, when you look at the percentage of our household spending that goes toward food, no other nation spends as little on their food as we do in the US. And this has a knock-on impact. We end up taking that food for granted by and large. We don't tend to value things that we don't spend much on. So as with abundance, the low cost or the low relative cost of food as a good means that we aren't particularly careful with it. And of course, it's a bit of an artificially low cost, driven in part by the subsidies that you see on the commodity crops that grow throughout much of the country. So it's a bit of an artificially low cost as gas is because of the subsidies, and it's having this impact of making us not so careful with our food, we'll say. I do get a kick out of this picture here because not only does it convey how inexpensive food tends to be, but it has a nice bit of cultural insensitivity to boot. Passover pork ribs, probably not all that popular, but anyway, I digress. Okay, so moving along, the next topic on why we're wasting so much food is a lost food knowledge. And what I mean there is that for a few generations, we've essentially stepped out of the kitchen, and we've lost some of those traditional food ways of knowing how to store our food, where to store it, how long things will stay good, how to repurpose some dishes into others, using our leftovers for creating other meals, and simply to tell if foods are good or bad. And we don't trust our senses. And so into that void, you see certain slogans like this one come in at the bottom of this package that I received taking food home from a restaurant. You see it say there, "When in doubt, throw it out." That might be good advice if you don't have a refrigerator, but it might be a bit extreme if you do. And it also says to use that food within 24 hours, which also seems a bit extreme. But that's just sort of a reflection of where we are and that loss of food knowledge. And another big indicator of that topic, or that loss of foodways, is the ubiquity of expiration dates or date labels. And so now they're not only on your bag salads or your bottle of milk, but they're on individual eggs, or my favorite, bottles of water. I don't know about you, but I can't remember the last time I drank rancid water. But I suppose there's always a first. You probably know that these date labels are a bit cautious, and you may not be one of the people who are throwing things out on the date on the package. But what you might not know is that these date labels are not required by federal law. The only thing required to have a date label on it by federal law is infant formula. And so the food producers are putting these dates on them voluntarily to, in part, to convey the freshness, to try and give the consumer that confidence. But as a result, unfortunately, the byproduct is that a lot of good food is going to waste. Okay, so we talked a bit about the drivers of wasted food, but why should you care? What's the big deal? Well, what I'm here to tell you about is that there are several reasons we should care about wasted food. And it's hard to not start with the ethical question on food waste. There's a certain saying that I grew up with, and I'm sure many of you heard. If we were in person, I'd ask people to call it out, but since we're not, I will just say that when I grew up, I heard this expression: "Clean your plate because there are people starving somewhere." The place tends to change based on when you grew up. For me, it was their children starving in Africa, which is a bit vague, not all that specific, but I tried not to be too much of a smart aleck as a kid, so I held on to that one. But that expression was problematic in other ways, not just in its non-specificity geographically. The food on your plate is never going to help anyone in need. By the time it reaches your home or your plate, it's not something that can be repurposed elsewhere. It's also a bit problematic because it's using guilt as a motivator to get people to think about others. But there is a kernel of truth within that saying, and there's perhaps a visceral reaction that many of you have when you see food being thrown away and you think about the people who could use that food. And so that juxtaposition of waste with hunger or food insecurity is what I would say morally callous, and is the reason, or the primary reason, that we need to reduce the amount of food that we're wasting. The idea of hunger in many folks' minds is leads people to think of the 1930s and the Great Depression, and a bread line or a soup line, or in this case, a coffee and donuts line, which doesn't sound terrible, but does not mask the suffering there. But unfortunately, the topic of hunger is anything but history. And there's more hunger today than there has been in a while, due in part to the pandemic and a lot of the disruptions in work and also in the food supply. And so, you'll have these situations of huge lines of cars, and that's because we have a great amount of need. About 38 million Americans are food insecure. And unfortunately, that's equating to about 15% of the population. And meanwhile, we're wasting about 40% of our food. So that juxtaposition is a huge paradox. And that is why I think it's just so important to focus on this topic. And, I'm sure a lot of you are have been focused on keeping recyclables out of the landfill for a good while. And that's important as well, but nowhere near as vital as keeping food out of the landfill. And that is for these moral and ethical reasons, but in addition for the environmental ones as well. So let's talk about those now. There are several impacts of wasted food, and let's see. I won't get into all of them. We won't talk about the changed land use too much. We're cutting down forests to grow more food that we then don't use, but that's part of it. But what I will talk about a bit is squandered water. As you see on this slide here, about a quarter of freshwater usage goes to produce food that is not used. So there's just this massive amount of embedded water in our food system. And when we waste as much food as we do, that water is being used in vain. And you probably have noticed that water is kind of a precious commodity these days, becoming increasingly precious as the planet warms up and the water tables get depleted. And so it's something we'll need to focus on more and more. But those numbers might not convey the picture of wasted foods, water squandering. So here's another way of looking at it. Every year, the US wastes about a Great Salt Lake's worth of water through the food that is wasted. And so that's the volume of the Great Salt Lake in Utah. Of course, it's fresh water, not salty, but that just gives you a sense for how much of an issue that is. Another way of thinking of it is the food waste leads to wasting as much water as 50 million American homes use in the average year. So a pretty significant amount. But perhaps more importantly, wasted food equals wasted resources. And in particular, or more specifically, it means a wasting of petroleum. So oil is embedded in just about every step of our food chain these days, as I'm sure many of you know. But it's used to fertilize, to plant, to harvest, to process, ship, cool, cook, and then when we're done with it, to haul that food waste off to the landfill. So our food system is tremendously oil dense, and you see the estimates there on the impact of our wasted food problem. And so the one that I think is most significant is that 4% one. So our wasted food is equivalent to about 4% of all US energy consumption. And so that's just this massive amount of oil or energy. It's about 300 million barrels of oil. But when I'm trying to impress upon people the importance of this topic, 4% doesn't really sound like much. So here's another way of looking at it. You probably remember the Deepwater Horizon oil spill from a few years back. Well, that was certainly an ecological disaster and one that will lead to problems for years to come. But every year we're squandering 70 times that amount of oil through the food that we don't use. So 70, it's a pretty significant amount. And just in case you don't remember what that looked like, we have this fine motion picture to jog your memory, which I have not seen, I have to admit. But anyhow, it's a major amount of energy that's embedded in our food system, and that leads to greenhouse gas emissions when we're using so much petroleum, and additionally when so much energy goes into creating our food. So as you see here, this is kind of an interesting one, but if food waste were a country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter after China and the US. And so that's just taking into account the carbon footprint, and the best estimates are that it's about 20 to 50 million tons of CO2 squandered every year emitted every year because of food waste. But then there's another part of this whole environmental topic, and it's probably one that you all are quite familiar with. But when food ends up in a landfill and it decomposes anaerobically, it creates methane. And methane is much more harmful than CO2 when it comes to trapping heat. Estimates are about 25 to 28 times more harmful than CO2 when it comes to its climate warming capability or trapping heat. And so, yeah, we're creating this problem when we send food to the landfill, and it's something that could be harnessed, but by and large, a lot of our landfills are just venting that methane off into the environment, or perhaps burning or flaring, and which mitigates some of the impacts, but leads to problems elsewhere. So a significant factor at play there. And when you add all of that up, the carbon impact and the methane impact, about 8 to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions are caused by our wasting of food. So it's this huge target, and it's not surprisingly something that leads climate thinkers to say, hey, we should focus on reducing food waste. And so this slide here talks about that. So Project Drawdown looks at all of the solutions that we can turn to mitigate against climate change. And there are two different models that they ran. The first model, food waste reduction, was the number 3 most impactful solution. Then they ran it again, and reducing food waste was the number 1 most impactful solution. So you can look at that 2 ways. I guess it might depend if you're an optimist or a pessimist, but it means that there's a huge problem happening here. But on the flip side, there's a major opportunity as well. And so here's a good time to shift gears and think about what that opportunity might look like, and how minimizing food waste can lead to major gains in the fight against climate change. In addition, can lead to a healthier planet ethically and socially. And so let's talk about some of those solutions and where we go from here. Okay, so yeah, here's the fun part. So we're done with the doom and gloom for now, and we can focus on the opportunity that we have. So there's this major target at hand of 40% of our food supply that's currently being wasted. And so how do we figure out where to go from here? Well, there's a mantra that we've all heard: reduce, reuse, recycle. And it's a good one. There's a reason it gets bandied about, but unfortunately we tend to focus most of our energy, or a lot of our energy, on the last part, the recycling. And there's a reason that reduce is the first R. And so when we apply that notion to the topic of food waste, as the EPA has done, there's a reason that source reduction, of the first R, basically, is at the top of that hierarchy. And so it's really important to approach all of our solutions for food waste using this hierarchy and keeping this in mind. And so primarily we want to not create as much excess food. Of course, there will always be some extra. We can't necessarily eliminate all excess food. So if we do have that, what's most important next is to feed hungry people. and to get that food to people in need. If we can't do that, then channeling excess food to livestock, as people have done for centuries or millennia. Having animals live on our farms, perhaps feeding them off our excess. It's kind of a tried and true use for food scraps. But if we can't do that, because, well, let's face it, not all of us live on farms anymore, then industrial uses is the next best way to put that food into use. And that might look like anaerobic digestion. It might look like rendering. It might look like a few other high-tech solutions for food waste. If we can't do that, then we should compost that food waste. And only if we can't do any of the above should we be sending food to a landfill or incinerating it. And unfortunately, in reality, this hierarchy is flipped on its head, and more than 90% of excess food ends up in a landfill or an incinerator. So we have some work to do here. How do we actually do that? Let's get into a few specifics. Well, awareness is a great place to start on the reduction front, trying to reduce the amount of excess food out there. So just getting people to realize that wasted food is a problem. That's step number one. Step number two is getting people to care about wasting food or preventing wasted food. So there's a really neat awareness campaign called Save the Food that many of you will have seen. It's a national campaign by the Ad Council, the same folks who created Smokey the Bear and Woodsy the Owl. Unfortunately, it hasn't quite reached the entire country, so it'd be great to see that expanded a bit farther. But the message is a sound one, and they're talking a great deal about date labels, as you see here. They're sort of playing off that date label topic of best by or best before. And yeah, wouldn't it be best if that bread was used? So I like that phrasing, and it's eye-catching as well. You see the date label on the egg and a bit of information on the environmental impact with the water squandering. So that's one way of doing things, and spreading that campaigns is important. There are local campaigns, and this might be something that you get into with the grant funding that you do have. And there's some neat ones I've seen at colleges, a few different ones there. That's really important when there's an all-you-can-eat cafeteria. And I've visited a bunch of places where they have messaging before you take the food, before you take too much. So that's kind of neat. That could work at a restaurant level, whether it's a buffet or a place with large portions. Both would have need for that kind of campaign. I've seen awareness campaigns in supermarkets as well, mostly in Europe. In this photo here comes from Italy. 50% discount on food that is soon to go past its date. A lot of retailers don't like to have that kind of setup because they feel like it conveys a lack of freshness. They don't want anything close to going bad to be highlighted. But I would say let's flip that around and say here's an opportunity to woo shoppers who are looking for a good deal. And especially these days, as there are more and more of us who are looking to cut costs on our foods, I think that would be pretty popular. There's actually a pretty neat app called Flash Food, which basically does that job for supermarkets and lets people buy discounted food on an app that they then pick up in a special refrigerator near the front of the store. Anyhow, the best place, in my humble opinion, to focus on food waste awareness is in schools. And this is where I've been dedicating a lot of my time these days, is to focus on young people and getting this message to America's youth by any means necessary, because frankly, we are doing a great job of educating our kids on wasting food. So there's so much food waste in education that we are essentially giving our kids a food waste education. We're basically training them to throw away food. I don't think that's what we want to be doing. I think we could do better. And there's a double impact that we could potentially have by reducing or eliminating wasted food in schools. And not only would we be harnessing that excess and getting it to people in need, but we'd be reaching kids and teaching them that food is not trash and food is something to value. Unfortunately, the way we do things today, a lot of it is we're not necessarily serving the best quality food, not giving kids enough time to eat, not having lunch after recess where they've built up an appetite. In the way we do things these days, a lot of times it's almost as if we want them to throw away food. So there's a lot of room for opportunity there. And frankly, when we don't teach kids that food is something to be valued, it's a real missed opportunity, because kids are really good at convincing their parents to do things. I'm sure that you've experienced that firsthand in one way or another, whether you were the one doing the convincing or being convinced by your kids. They're pretty good at bringing information home and nagging us to do things the right way. And we've seen young people be great ambassadors for certain issues like recycling. And now I would argue it's time to harness the power of America's youth to convince us stodgy old folks that food waste is something we need to eliminate, or at least greatly minimize. One really easy way to do this in schools is to have a share table or a food table, where when students get things that they don't want, they just put it on the food table. And you can take things from the food table, you can leave things. It's a fairly easy solution to this problem. All you need is a horizontal surface. Any table will do. And it's usually something that once schools implement, they find it really takes off and leads to a lot less food ending up in the barrel. Now, once food is on that table, there's actually a couple of outcomes you can see. Obviously, peers can take things, but in addition, the USDA has allowed schools to reserve items one time if they've been left and not taken, as long as they're wiped down. If they're fruits, as you see there, with an edible peel. Sealed items, there's no problem there. So like your applesauce or your box of raisins or your cheese stick or whatever it may be, that can easily be repurposed. The other thing that you see is a redistribution of excess food. And so sometimes the food that students aren't going to eat is then aggregated and redistributed to nonprofits, to local groups who are fighting hunger. I've seen that done where the food goes to actual nonprofit groups. I've also seen it happen where the school has a refrigerator where families that are in need can come pick up some excess food. Also, food can be sent home in backpacks with kids, in particular on weekends, where a lot of times for kids who are getting most of their sustenance in school, weekends can be a bit of an issue, as can summers. So there's a real opportunity there to put a dent in food insecurity or hunger. But so I'm talking a bit about schools, and that's an area I'm passionate about, but this whole topic is something that can happen elsewhere as well. the idea of food recovery or food rescue is so important because, as we've discussed, there's this massive amount of excess out there. So because there's food that's being squandered just about everywhere in the food chain, it's really important to focus on the healthiest food possible for redistribution. So that's why I love cleaning as an operation or as an idea. Getting that unprocessed healthy food to those in need is really important and really neat. It's not just handy or helpful for the people receiving that food, but also the volunteers who are out there picking that food. It's really tangible and rewarding work. But it's also hard work. So I realize that it's a bit difficult logistically to get all of that food from the fields. So at times, maybe it's easier to go to places where the food's already been harvested or aggregated, like a farmer's market or a supermarket, where there's a lot that goes to waste. So it's important to get into food recovery or rescue and really focus on the healthiest foods. And unfortunately, the healthiest foods tend to be the most perishable usually. So your produce and your proteins primarily, but that means a lot of stores are hesitant to donate. Most every store is donating some kind of food, but unfortunately it tends to be the less healthy options, the starches, the breads, and in many cases the sweets that go bad pretty quickly or that aren't at their peak of freshness. But they're a bit squeamish when it comes to donating food that needs to be refrigerated or even frozen. And so that fear of liability is what's usually driving that reluctance. But what I would love to communicate to you all today is that there doesn't need to be that fear of liability, because there is this federal shield bill, this federal law that protects donors from liability. So the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Act says that if you in good faith give food to a nonprofit to redistribute, then you can't be held liable if someone were to get sick. And I can't believe how often I hear that fear of lawsuit being thrown around as a reason for not donating food. And it really frustrates me because I know there's this shield law on the books, but it's important to remind folks, if there is that reluctance to donate, that they don't need to be afraid. And the thing that's funny too is that there's often this mention of people being sued, but here's a list of all of the food donation liability suits that have happened in this country. So that's a blank slide on purpose, and there have not been any suits where someone has figuratively turned around and bitten the hand that's feeding them. So perhaps that fear of liability is at times more of an excuse, and maybe it speaks to a bit of apathy or not wanting to bother with going through the process of donating food. That's where we can step in and encourage donation and maybe talk about some of the benefits, not just that you're getting food to people in need, but that there are also potential tax benefits for donors. So it can be a win-win situation. But anyhow, whatever we do, we need to stop the status quo of seeing food as trash and readily throwing food away. So this might look like a variety of things depending on where you are in the system. But for most of us here today who are at the end of the line when it comes to the food chain, landfills should not be the path of least resistance for food. and food does not belong in landfills. So awareness will certainly help, but incentivizing reduction of food waste and redistributing that excess food elsewhere is so important. And so that might mean turning to policy, might mean establishing policies that can change the status quo. On the former there are 8 states that have enacted landfill food bans, so have made it illegal to throw away food. And that is a really helpful solution for food waste. It's been incredibly impactful when trying to keep food out of the landfill and create an infrastructure for redistributing food or composting it. Municipalities have also banned food from landfill. San Francisco, New York, Seattle, Austin, Oregon Metro, out in Portland. And that might be something that you might look at as a regional authority. Now, a lot of people might say, what good would that do? Just keeping food out of the landfill. It's the end of the line, or the end of the food chain. But in my view, and from what I've seen, that one step, just making it illegal to throw away food, has a dramatic impact at how we approach food at all steps of the food chain. So all throughout, from farm to fork, and even afterwards to the landfill. So I think it's worth considering. I know that might be a little bit of a political difficulty these days, where most of the states that have banned food from landfills tend to be some of the more liberal ones: California, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, Rhode Island, New York, Maryland, and New Jersey. Those are the 8. But what I would argue is that there's nothing more conservative than conserving a resource. And there's bipartisan support for bills that have tried to address food date labeling. Actually, just today, the Food Date Labeling Act was reintroduced by bipartisan members of the House. And there's a bipartisan food recovery caucus at the federal level. So there's hope there. And I do think it's an issue that everyone can get behind, because nobody wants to see hunger and no one wants to see food being thrown away. But if you're not able to enact that kind of ban, there's plenty more to be done. The pay as you throw model really requires people to think about what they're throwing away and to reduce that amount. So that's a neat option as well. Some of you may already be turning to that model, but if not, it's worth examining. And then trying to help build an excess food infrastructure, trying to prevent that food from reaching a landfill by encouraging donation, and at the very least, getting that food to an anaerobic digester or a composter, or perhaps to livestock. That certainly would work as well. And here's an opportunity to bring business on board, to tell the food industry about the tax deduction benefits that are available for donations. And a lot of folks might not be aware that they can receive tax deductions for donations. But another thing we could do is to streamline some of the process there, because it can be a bit daunting for some of the smaller businesses who might not have an army of accountants to work through some of those benefits. And a lot of the mom and pop operations are donating food out of the kindness of their heart because they know it's the right thing to do, but aren't receiving the tax benefits that they could. And that might make it more feasible to do on a larger scale. So there's an opportunity there. And additionally, we can play matchmaker a bit, where you as folks in the know in your area can set up local nonprofits, connect them with some of the larger sources of excess food, whether it's restaurants or retailers or institutions even. So anyway, we need to use all the available levers that we have, whether it's resale, food recovery, anaerobic digestion, composting, feeding livestock, etc. All the above to keep food out of landfill. And lastly, I mentioned anaerobic digestion a few times, but it's something that is quite expensive, obviously, to get started, but will the return on the investment happens rather quickly, given that we have so much of our feedstock or excess food out there. So here's an opportunity to not only keep food out of landfill, but to do something good with it. And that's important. So there's so much that we can do when it comes to reducing our food waste and then harnessing that excess for good. Creating energy through anaerobic digestion is important, but obviously we want to think about that entire hierarchy of actions and really act upon that hierarchy as high up in that hierarchy as we can. And lastly, I'll say, just in reading the news on food waste, it seems just about every day I hear something new, a new solution where we're creating uses for excess food. And just today I read about a University of Maryland study where they're making bioplastics from food waste. And so, that's pretty cool. I would warn that it's easier in some cases to focus on the lower parts of that hierarchy, the industrial uses or the composting, but it's all the more important to really think about the first item there, the reduction of food waste, and the second item, getting that excess food to those in need, because there is so much need out there. So regardless of whether we're feeding hungry people or making bioplastics out of food waste, we do need more attention and more wins on the topic of food waste, because we have set these lofty goals as a country of reducing food waste by 50% by the year 2030. Well, that's pretty soon. When we set that goal in 2015, it felt a lot farther away, but it's just around the corner. So we have these lofty goals, but we need more progress because, well, frankly, the stakes are pretty high. When you look at the global population, the estimate is that there will be 9.5 billion of us by 2050. So that's a lot of zeros there and a lot of mouths to feed. Of course, there's also the environmental impacts. So the stakes are pretty high in that direction as well. But just thinking about feeding everyone on this planet, when agricultural thinkers and planners see those figures, they jump to that conclusion that we're going to have to cut down more forests to grow more food, maybe turn to genetically modified crops. There are all these, frankly, drastic solutions bandied about. And, that may or may not be necessary. But my point here is that before we turn to those drastic remedies, let's focus on efficiency and being as efficient with our food supply as we can. It's not rocket science in many cases. It's very achievable. It just takes a little time and effort and, frankly, awareness. So hopefully after hearing me talk for a bit and talking amongst yourselves and working on this topic through the grant that you've received, you're well attuned to the problem of wasted food and are going to become not just ambassadors for minimizing food waste, but food waste warriors, because we need more of you out there spreading the word. And just on a real basic level, we have enough food out there to feed everyone. So it's just a matter of finding the will to redistribute that food a bit better and to be more aware of the topic of wasted food. And it's something that can have a dramatic impact on our planet, on the health of our planet, but also the health of our planet's inhabitants. So in my view, there's no better topic to focus on, and there's no better use of time than tackling wasted food in this country. So with that, I will end there, and I'd love to take your questions, and I'm encouraged to get a bit of a dialogue going, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the topic. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was a very expansive presentation. I guess it gave us a lot to think about. So I want to open it up to, like you said, a discussion now. Does anybody have any questions about anything that Jonathan spoke about? Want him to expand on anything?
There's actually
Sheila?
a question in the chat from Tom and Laura, sort of amplifying that they'd like to know more about case studies or best practices related to streamlined tax incentives for donating food.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way it's set up now, retailers and restaurants and institutions can receive tax deductions for donating food to 501c3 organizations. They have to be officially nonprofits working in hunger relief. But there's a set value that food companies take per pound donated. So they basically just have to keep track of the poundage being donated. And a lot of the nonprofits will come around and collect food, will do that for companies. They'll be the ones to tabulate everything and get them the data they need. And I think the one thing I'd say in addition is it's a little tricky logistically at times to recover food, because you're basically asking the stores to invest a bit of labor to pull things and to set them aside. But when there's a partnership with that nonprofit and when there's good communication, it works quite well. And it's a real win-win, because not only are the stores receiving that deduction, but they might even be saving money on their waste bill if they are paying per ton, or even if it's by the pull, they might be able to reduce the amount of collection that they're having. And of course, they're secure in the knowledge that they're helping people. And that's one thing actually I'd love to see more is stores trumpet their good works and get credit for helping people in need. A lot of times they don't necessarily want to publicize it because they might think their clients or their customers won't like the idea that some people are getting free food, or I don't know, there's a few different reasons, but I'd love to see stores kind of claim that as doing the good works that they are doing.
May I ask a follow-up question on that?
Sure.
Jonathan, thank you for your presentation. It was fantastic. Do you have any examples on streamlined tax incentives related to wholesale distributors, folks working at that level?
I don't have specific examples, but I do know that it happens. there's a bunch around, let's see. So around Salinas, where there's so much fresh produce in California, there are a lot of, there's a lot of produce being donated. And then at most ports of entry in the country, especially near Nogales, Arizona, I know of nonprofits that have set up with wholesalers and are like bursting at the seams with donations, because like there's just so much fresh food coming to this country, and when there's a delay at the border, that can lead to problems. You know, it's a very time sensitive business. So so I know it's happening and is a pretty tried and true strategy, but I don't have the specifics on what the tax deductions look like for the wholesalers, but I could put you in touch with some people who would. Okay, yeah, that's great. And I see your plus in the chat, Tom, so that now I understand what you're saying there.
Sheila, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks so much. And Jonathan, what a great presentation. I mean, it just packed full of information. It was so good. You've clearly done a lot of work on this topic. I'm curious to find out how much of the food waste do you know is produce versus packaged food? Because it sounds like there's a big distribution problem. I mean, if you're leaving, you know, food in the field, but we've got these huge agribusiness farms that just plant way too much food. And how do you sensibly get fresh food distributed, you know, to a wide radius of areas? So I don't know, how do you solve that problem?
Yeah, I mean, that's the huge question that has existed for the last 15 years. I've been looking at this topic, and it's tricky. The logistics around recovering food from the farm level are hard, just because labor is expensive. That's where, because there is so much excess, maybe it makes sense to focus on the packing shed excess, you know, the stuff that's already been harvested, but maybe does not make the cut when it comes to being packaged for redistribution. So it really varies by crop, and that's where it gets difficult to make generalizations. But you know, for example, with potatoes, there's really a culling process of ones that are fit for retail and ones that aren't. And so, you know, if you can connect the nonprofit to that large grower, whatever crop it might be, there's probably going to be that channel of not quite good enough for sale, but perfectly edible. And so that's what I would recommend. Gleaning is really an awesome opportunity for opening eyes and winning hearts and minds, but it's not a great way for getting sheer tonnage on a consistent basis. There was that's another opportunity for policy or public funding. There was what they call it in California, they had a concurrent picking program where the harvesters were basically creating two piles, like one for retail and one for donation. But that's not easy to do and took a little bit of money. So there was some funding from the state level to do that. So that's one opportunity there. And then, yeah, just finding a way to really get the trucks or vans out to those larger operations. That takes some money. But if the growers were to fully realize the tax deductions, that's sort of another way that they might be able to do that at no expense to them, but it would take some time. So a bit of a hard ask, but it's one that's worth asking.
We had a question and comment in the chat, Jonathan. Have you heard anything about the partner commitment between EPA and USDA to reduce food waste 50% by 2030? Announcement occurred more than 5 years ago. I wonder if there's renewed focus. So he also said USDA supports the free milk and free lunch programs for districts in income constrained zip codes. He's often wondered if this program could allow for greater reimbursement for those districts that couple these programs with food waste solutions.
Ooh, wow. Well, that's a good idea. I haven't seen that in practice, but maybe it's one that you could put into play locally. Who knows? But to the larger question, what's been happening in the last 5 years? Not a whole lot is the short answer. That, I mean, it's hard to avoid getting into politics when talking about this topic, but frankly, there wasn't a lot of focus on anything environmental under the last administration. And so hopefully there will be larger emphasis on this topic in the current administration. But I was a bit disappointed that the latest large gathering at COP21, like there wasn't much talk of food waste at the international level. And that tends to be the driver for the domestic conversation on food waste. Like the whole reason we had that 50% by 2030 goal was because the FAO, the UN FAO, and a couple other international organizations sort of set that example. So, you know, I guess my main point here is that talk is cheap and setting a goal is really easy to do, but backing it up and making progress is where the hard work happens, and really hasn't happened enough. So, you know, I'm a bit pessimistic on whether or not we'll reach that goal, but you could also see it as, you know, this huge opportunity, and it wouldn't be that difficult to make a huge dent in wasted food. I don't know about 50%, but at least making a sizable impact. And the last thing I'll say on that topic is, you know, I try to be optimistic professionally on this topic, but at times, you know, we'll be a bit less so privately. But I visited this place called Concordia College in Minnesota, and they set this really ambitious 50% reduction goal after, or in conjunction with my visit there. And yeah, I sort of scoffed at it to myself. I was like, there's no way. Like, I mean, it's so admirable. Wow, good for them. But the joke's on me, because they actually met that goal. And in 5 short years, actually less than 5 years, they've been able to reduce food waste on campus by 50%. So where there's a will, there's a way. And I think hopefully we'll take some inspiration from that.
Anybody else have any questions or thoughts for Jonathan?
Yeah, I just have a question for you. You know, you talk about the tax incentives for feeding people, and it involves, you know, nonprofits. Would there be any tax incentives for feeding animals? Do they apply to that?
I don't believe that they do, but in that case, you might actually be able to be paid for that excess. You know, if the grower or the farmer is not having to buy as much feed, you know, depending on where you are, there might be a market for that good. And especially where there are anaerobic digestion or compost facilities, and there's a bit of competition for that feedstock, then you do start to see a market develop. And that's where those state food waste bans have been so effective in creating a market for excess food, and also an infrastructure for collecting that excess, whether it's to go to an AD plant or even just to compost it. You know, I think in 20 years, we're going to look back on this day where food was being thrown away as it's just sort of this laughable scenario where we're just throwing away this resource. But so if we can kind of use that hindsight to our benefit and try and change how we approach food and see it more as a resource. And I think some of these markets and opportunities will arise.
Thank you.
Jonathan, I had a question. It's a slightly more of a 30,000-foot view question, I guess. So, back to building awareness, and, the first step is building awareness, letting people know there is a problem. And then really the crucial part is getting them to care enough to do something about it. And I'm just wondering, in all your work, what, I guess there's the term, you got to have a hook. If you're educating somebody or entertaining somebody, what's your hook? What do you get? How do you connect with people? And I'm just wondering if you found, there's different reasons why we should care. Like you said, the environment, hunger, food insecurity. One that I've thought about is, caring about, all the workers who are out there harvesting all this for you, working for substandard wages and substandard conditions. There's all these reasons to care, but I'm just wondering what you found resonates with people that you talk to, whether that be adults or kids.
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. It sort of depends who you're talking to. With adults, it's usually like saving a buck or two. That tends to be what gets people's attention. But also there's the visceral response of like seeing food being thrown away. It's a lot of people will have that like painful reaction to seeing a dumpster full of cake or this perfectly good lettuce being thrown into a landfill. And if you can tie that back to family connections, like, oh, my grandma used to make this soup with all the bits and pieces of vegetables. Like if you can make that historical family connection, you're doing well. With young people, it tends to be helping others and just seeing that need out there. If you can tie in the donation piece with the need and actually have kids involved in seeing a food bank, for example, or seeing a soup kitchen, letting them even make the connection if they're old enough that, that's weird. We throw away food every day at school, and here I am serving a dinner to people who have a hard time finding enough food. Like treating kids with respect to draw their own conclusions and allowing them to come to those solutions can be really powerful. And as we all know, like no one wants to be told what to do, but if they see it as their own idea, it's all the more impactful. So I guess the short answer is it depends who you're talking to, but I'm sure you'll come up with a neat way to message this topic, and there's so many ways to do it. It's almost like the hard part is figuring out what the best option is.
Thank you. Anybody else? We have about 4 minutes left scheduled for the meeting. And so anybody have any burning questions or thoughts you want to share with while we still have Jonathan and everybody on the call? Okay, seeing and hearing none. Lisa?
Actually,
Yeah.
there is one that came directly to me, I think by accident. It
Good.
says there's social media groups in Kansas City that coordinate looking for excess food from restaurants and local food industry to get people in need. And maybe there's not really a question, but just a comment.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say there is, yeah, there are folks out there, I'm sure, who are already tackling this topic and recovering food from restaurants and retailers. And it's just a question of sort of how much they're able to do, and maybe their work can be amplified or complemented through the work of this group. But yeah, I find that it's a topic that brings people together. It's something that gets people excited because no one wants to waste food, and it is this resource out there that's just available to be harnessed. but it does take some doing. So finding allies and working with people who are already tackling this topic is something definitely worth focusing on, and it can be really rewarding.
All righty. Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. You're a great presenter, and I hope that, you know, I told you about our food waste grant that we have over the next 2 years. Hopefully you'll agree to be a sounding board for us for some of our ideas and thoughts, because you come with a wealth of information, and I think you could be a definite asset to our program. So thanks a lot. Lisa,
No, I'd love
Yeah.
I'd love to help however I can. I can't wait to hear what you get up to.
Cool. Thank you. Lisa, you want to?
Yeah, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming. Do you want to have any closing parting thoughts, Doug?
No, again, just thanking everyone for showing up to the meeting, and especially for Jonathan sharing his information and insights. They were very thought-provoking, and gave us a lot of, I hate to say it, food for thought. But anyway, thank you all for attending, and thank you for all the work that you've done. And I'll put Lisa on the spot only to say, if we have any idea of calendar of meetings for 2022 yet.
I will have that posted on our meeting website, but it is always the third Wednesday of the month. The executive board meetings are in odd months, so January, March, and the management council meetings are always on even months, so February, April. So I will get that posted for 2022. It's looking like right now we can probably try to do hybrid meetings. Again, that could change next week. So I'll certainly let people know when that hybrid opportunity is there versus a virtual only meeting. So I do want to say that we did record this meeting, and I will make the recording available. If you are interested, let me know, and I can certainly send you a link when it's posted up on YouTube. Okay, and again, thank you, Jonathan. It was a great presentation, and we're so glad that you could join us today. So with that, I'll close down the meeting, and I hope everyone has a safe and wonderful holiday season. And
Thank
we'll
you,
see you
everyone.
next year.
Thank you.
Thank
Right.
you.
Happy holidays, everyone. Thanks.